Welcome to Tochi Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The scent of disinfectant lingered in the mansion's hallway as Chioma's fingers, rough from years of scrubbing, trailed gently over the marble surface of the banister. Her eyes, hollow yet soft, reflected a kind of sadness only known by those who had lost everything. At just 24, she carried the weight of tragedies most could not imagine. Her father had died clutching a charred Bible in the corner of their home. Her mother's screams echoed in the deepest parts of her dreams, and her little siblings, one barely old enough to walk, were lost in a fire that stole not only her family but her purpose. Now she moved like a shadow through Chief Obinna's mansion, a ghost among the living, her smile small, her presence invisible. Her maid uniform hung loosely on her slim frame, and her scarf barely held back the tight coils of her hair as she swept and mopped with practiced silence. The other maids respected her quiet nature. To them, she was the girl who had once laughed loudly, before death silenced her joy. To Chioma, each day was simply survival. Upstairs, behind the polished double doors of the boys' wing, Junior sat on the floor with a tattered toy car in his lap. The boy barely spoke anymore, not since his real mother died and a new one had taken her place. Clarissa, the new wife of his father, Chief Obinna, was everything his late mother wasn't. Cold, loud, angry. She had a smile that never reached her eyes and hands that jerked instead of comforted. Junior flinched whenever she entered a room, choosing instead to hide behind furniture or close himself inside closets. Only one person had ever seen him laugh since his mother's death, Chioma. She had once stumbled into his room carrying a tray of bread and spilled the juice on herself, her expression mortified. Junior had giggled. That moment had sparked something. Since then, he had waited near the stairs when he knew she would pass by, eyes brightening ever so slightly in her presence. She reminded him of safety, of kindness, of a mother. That evening, as dusk bled through the tall windows, Chief Obinna stood in his office, staring at an untouched glass of scotch. He wasn't sure what disturbed him more, the growing silence in his son's eyes or the disconnection in his own home. Clarissa, his second wife, had promised warmth, companionship, and healing, but all she had brought was tension and chaos. His son barely spoke to him, and his staff moved with anxiety. Yet earlier that day, as he walked past the servants' quarters, he had caught a glimpse of Chioma crouched down, tying Junior's shoelace, her face soft and full of patience. Junior had looked up at her with admiration, a flicker of joy returning to his face. Obinna had paused for too long, unsettled not by what he saw, but by what he felt, a familiar gentleness, a presence that echoed memories he had buried beneath grief. He said nothing and walked away, unaware that a storm had just begun to gather in his own home. The sound of Clarissa's heels against the marble floors was enough to stiffen every spine in the house. Her presence was like a chill, unwelcome, unnerving, and impossible to ignore. She thrived on control and loved the power she held over the staff. She would leave expensive perfumes and jewelry lying around intentionally, only to accuse a random maid of theft just to watch them cry. Every day felt like a test, and every mistake, even imagined ones, became a reason for punishment. One afternoon, she made the cook kneel for burning stew. Another, she slapped the youngest, made for spilling water near her feet. Yet behind her designer dresses and perfect makeup was a woman constantly paranoid, looking over her shoulder, obsessed with appearances and control. But none of her venom matched what she reserved for her stepson. Junior, to Clarissa, was the one reminder that she would never be Chief Obinna's first love or the woman who bore his child. And for that, she hated him. Junior, on his part, had learned how to move in silence. He kept to corners, never made noise, and flinched at sudden movements. The boy who once ran joyfully through the garden with a slingshot was now withdrawn, fearful, and suspicious. He dreaded the evenings most when his father was out, and Clarissa was left alone with him. Her words were always cruel. She would lean down and whisper, "You're not even handsome like your father," or, "If your mother loved you, she wouldn't have died." These words would echo in his head at night, and though he tried not to cry, sometimes the tears came anyway. The only comfort he had was Chioma's presence. She never asked questions, never tried to replace his mother. She simply existed near him in peace, and that was enough to make the darkness feel less suffocating. Chief Obinna remained mostly blind to the depth of Clarissa's cruelty. He worked long hours and had grown used to the growing distance between him and his son. Whenever he tried to talk to Junior, the boy would only nod or say yes, sir, with his head bowed. Obinna had convinced himself that grief was the problem, that maybe time would heal the boy. Clarissa, on the other hand, presented herself as the ever-concerned wife and stepmother, sighing dramatically about how Junior never allowed her in. Her manipulations were subtle, but calculated. When a maid whispered to Obinna that Clarissa had struck the boy, she twisted the story, saying the maid was jealous of her place in the household. Obinna, emotionally numb, had let it go. But still, something began to feel wrong, something deeper than stress. And once again, his mind returned to the quiet maid whose presence calmed even the most broken soul under his roof. It was a humid afternoon when Chioma found Junior seated alone behind the curtain in the corridor, holding a cracked plastic toy in his hand. She had just finished sweeping the guest room and hadn't expected to see anyone there. His small fingers fiddled with the bent wheel of the toy car as his shoulders curled forward, as if trying to disappear into himself. Chioma crouched low and smiled gently, not wanting to frighten him. "Do you want some roasted yam?" she asked softly, revealing a small wrapped piece she had saved from lunch. He looked up, unsure, eyes darting toward the staircase to check if Clarissa was near. When she shook her head reassuringly, he took it with small hands, biting into it with the urgency of hunger and caution. Chioma didn't speak further. She just sat beside him in silence, and when she accidentally dropped her rag trying to adjust her wrapper, Junior let out a giggle. It was a small, almost inaudible sound. But to Chioma, it was thunder. The staff corridor that afternoon was unusually quiet, and from the upstairs landing, Chief Obinna had just finished a phone call when he glanced down and saw them. The image struck him like a memory from another life. His late wife used to crouch the same way, laughing softly with Junior, feeding him roasted yam, because he always said it tasted better from her hand. Something warm moved in Obinna's chest, something forgotten. He didn't move or speak. He just watched the boy lean into the maid's side, as if she were a shield against a world too cruel for his age. He noticed how Chioma didn't look at him, didn't try to impress, didn't even know he was watching. She simply existed in the most honest way, gentle, respectful, and filled with the kind of maternal grace you couldn't buy with money. Obinna felt a strange pang of shame. When last did he laugh with his son? Later that evening, the mansion buzzed with whispers. The cook told the driver she had seen Junior smiling again, for the first time since Madame Clarissa arrived. Mama Peace, the elderly cook, said, "That girl Chioma, she carries peace in her spirit. Mark my words." Meanwhile, Clarissa passed through the corridor and caught sight of Chioma gently brushing dust from Junior's shirt. Her eyes narrowed. The fragile thread of her control was beginning to unravel, and she could sense it. In her mind, Chioma was nothing more than an orphan girl from the ashes, yet somehow she was undoing everything Clarissa had built. Clarissa turned on her heels, the quiet rage in her footsteps building toward a storm that no one, not even Chioma, was prepared for. Clarissa's footsteps echoed like thunder as she stormed into the kitchen later that evening, her perfectly painted nails clutched around her diamond-studded phone. She had seen enough. The boy she could barely control had just smiled at that maid, that ash-scented, barefoot little charity case she allowed to serve in her home out of pity. Jealousy rose in her like venom. Her power in the household had been built on fear and silence, Junior's silence, the maid's silence, even her husband's detachment. But Chioma had shifted something, subtly, dangerously. Clarissa walked up to her and in front of the entire kitchen staff, slapped the tray out of Chioma's hand. "Did I ask you to get close to my son?" she screamed. Chioma froze, her eyes wide but her lips sealed. The room tensed like stretched wire. Clarissa's voice cracked with rage as she raised her hand again, But this time, Mama Peace stepped forward and caught her wrist midair. The entire kitchen froze. Never had anyone stopped Madame Clarissa. Her face turned pale, then red, then white again. Mama Peace, the oldest and most respected staff, looked her dead in the eye and said, "That girl is not your problem. Your problem is your heart." The words cut sharper than the slap she had intended. Clarissa, trembling with fury, looked around at the other maids. No one moved. Not a single one defended her. The message was clear. Enough was enough. Clarissa scoffed, her heels clicking as she walked away, but the damage had already been done. That night, she stormed into Obinna's study and demanded that Chioma be fired immediately. "She's disrespectful. She's polluting this house," she yelled. Obinna, fatigued from a long board meeting, barely lifted his eyes. "She's the only person that's made my son smile," he said softly. And then, to Clarissa's horror, he added, "I'm not firing her." Down in the maid's quarters, Chioma sat on her tiny bed, hands shaking. Not from the slap or the shame, but from the fact that someone had defended her. Mama Peace, silent and watchful, now sat beside her, gently placing a bowl of warm ogbono soup in her hands. "You've done nothing wrong," the old woman said. "Some people feel threatened by peace because they live in chaos." Chioma nodded, but her eyes burned. She didn't want to be a source of drama. She had come here to hide, to survive. She didn't even realize how deeply her presence was being noticed, not just by Clarissa, but by the very man who had once walked through his home like a grieving ghost. And now, as the staff's silent rebellion simmered beneath the surface, Chioma was about to find herself at the center of a household war she never wanted, but would be forced to endure. Chief Obinna sat alone in his late wife's reading room, a small sunlit space filled with her old books and the faint scent of lavender. It had been nearly 2 years since she passed, but the ache hadn't lessened. It had only buried itself deeper. He had married Clarissa not out of love, but out of pressure, fatigue, and the hollow fear that Junior needed a mother. What he had gotten instead was a storm in human form. His wife had been gentle, bookish, a quiet woman who wrote poetry in the margins of her Bible and planted hibiscus with their son every Saturday morning. Obinna used to find peace in the sound of her humming. Now the only sounds he heard were Clarissa's complaints, her constant shouting, and the strange silence between him and his son. That morning, he opened a drawer and found a faded photo of his wife, holding Junior at age 3. Her smile, calm, complete, made his heart cave in. The image of Chioma tying Junior's shoelace replayed in his mind. It wasn't just her kindness, it was her gentleness, her presence. She didn't try to impress. She didn't speak much. But when she did, it was with sincerity. And in that silence, Obinna began to feel something unusual stirring, awareness. His grief had numbed him for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to notice another human being's presence. Chioma reminded him of something he had locked away, the ability to feel warmth. He walked quietly to the garden later that afternoon and found her there, humming softly as she pulled weeds near the roses. Junior was seated nearby with a drawing pad. They didn't see him, and he didn't interrupt. He just watched. And for a brief second, he saw his old life again, not in memory, but in motion. That evening, he invited the maids to sit in the back veranda and eat pepper soup together. It was something his wife used to do to make the house feel like a home. Clarissa rolled her eyes when she saw them gathered and muttered under her breath, "He's turning this place into a compound." But Obinna didn't care. The laughter of the maids, especially when Chioma chuckled softly at something Mama Peace said, reminded him that healing might not come in grand gestures, but in small, honest moments. Still, he said nothing about his growing affection. It wasn't romantic, not yet. It was respect. It was admiration. But it was something Clarissa couldn't miss. And in her eyes, admiration for another woman, especially a maid, was unforgivable. Chioma sat at the far end of the laundry room that night, folding bedsheets in practiced silence. Beside her sat Ada, one of the newer maids, only 19 and often jittery. Ada, unable to hold back her curiosity, asked softly, "Why don't you talk much?" Chioma looked up, her eyes gentle but tired. And then, for the first time since she arrived at the mansion, she spoke about the fire. She told of the night their thatched house caught flames while she was at the village stream. She spoke of running barefoot back home only to find her little sister's screams trapped behind collapsing wood, of how her mother had shielded her baby brother with her own body, and how none of them made it out. She had dug with her bare hands until the police pulled her away, her nails bleeding, her soul collapsing. Ada was crying by the time Chioma finished. "I'm sorry," she whispered. But Chioma only gave a half smile. "I used to dream," she said, "to be a teacher, to build something better. But now this is where God wants me." What Chioma didn't know was that Chief Obinna, having passed by to check on some linen reports, had paused outside the room. He had heard everything. Her voice, though soft, carried the weight of unspeakable loss. And yet, she folded bedsheets. She swept floors. She comforted a broken child. She never once asked for pity. Something in Obinna's heart shifted, not from obligation or attraction, but from recognition. He, too, knew what it meant to lose everything and still keep breathing. That night, in the quiet of his study, Obinna sat with a pen in hand, staring at an unsigned document Clarissa had given him earlier, something about transferring part of his land into her name. He placed it aside. His mind kept returning to Chioma, not because she was beautiful, though she was in a quiet, earthy way, but because she stood. She stood in grief. She stood in pain. She stood with dignity. And that was something money could never buy. Meanwhile, Clarissa, wrapped in silk and scent, stood in nothing but vanity and threat. A storm was building, and Obinna was no longer sure he wanted to shelter her from it. Clarissa paced her bedroom like a caged lioness, seething. Her reflection in the mirror mocked her, flawless makeup, silk nightgown, and an aura of control that was slipping by the day. Every time she passed Junior's room, she heard muffled laughter, his laughter. And the sound didn't come from her. It came from that girl, the one who cleaned floors like she was born for it. Chioma's very existence had become a thorn in Clarissa's perfectly manicured side. But tonight, her fury wasn't born from speculation. It came from discovery. Earlier that day, while pretending to inspect the staff quarters, Clarissa had rummaged through Chioma's small wooden box. There, tucked beneath a faded towel, was a burnt family photo. Chioma, her parents, and her little siblings, all smiling. It wasn't just the image, it was the emotion trapped inside it. That photo, half-scorched, still radiated love. And Clarissa, who had built her life around beauty and control, felt something she hadn't felt in years: insignificance. At dinner, with the staff quietly clearing plates, and Obinna seated silently beside her, Clarissa struck, holding up the burnt photo like it was diseased. She mocked Chioma in front of everyone. "Tell me, do you clean as well as your dead mother cooked?" she sneered. The room froze. Junior gasped audibly, his small hand gripping the table edge. Chioma stood still, the tray in her hands trembling, but her eyes stayed locked on Clarissa's. She said nothing, but the silence was heavier than any scream. Obinna, stunned at first, slowly turned to his wife. "What is wrong with you?" he asked, his voice calm but sharp. "You've crossed a line." It was the first time in months that he had openly chastised her. The staff exchanged glances, shock, hope, fear, all brewing in the atmosphere like a coming storm. Clarissa laughed, trying to shrug it off, but her eyes betrayed panic. Her power, once absolute, was beginning to crack. That night, Chioma sat alone in the servants' quarters, her burnt photo in her lap, its edges now slightly more torn. But instead of crying, she folded it gently and tucked it back under her clothes. Mama Peace sat beside her, offering her a warm wrap and a cup of pap. "They mocked Jesus too, my dear," the elderly woman whispered. "But he never stopped walking." Chioma nodded, but stayed silent. Meanwhile, in his study, Chief Obinna poured himself a drink he didn't touch. Clarissa's words had not only disgusted him, they had exposed her. Her inability to show empathy, her viciousness, and her jealousy were no longer rumors whispered by maids. He had witnessed it, and while he still didn't know what he felt toward Chioma, one thing was clear. Whatever it was pure, and Clarissa had no right to destroy it. The mansion slept under a heavy moon when Chioma heard the soft knock on her door. At first, she thought it was one of the younger maids, maybe Ada needing help again with her chores. But when she opened it, she froze. Chief Obinna stood in the dim hallway, no guards, no airs, just a tired man with hands clasped behind his back. He didn't step in. He simply said, "I heard about your grandmother's health. Let me help." Chioma's heart thudded painfully in her chest. Her grandmother had raised her after the fire. She was all she had left. And her failing health had been eating away at Chioma's peace. But she hadn't asked anyone for money, let alone the master of the house. "Sir, I didn't," she stammered. Obinna raised a hand. "You didn't ask. That's why I'm offering." He handed her an envelope and turned to leave before she could speak again. Chioma stood with the envelope in hand, unsure if she was shaking from shock or emotion. Inside was more money than she had ever held at once in her life. But it wasn't the amount that undid her, it was the gesture. No one had offered her kindness, without expectation, since her family died. And this wasn't pity, it was respect. Meanwhile, Clarissa stood behind the curtain in the hallway upstairs. She had followed her husband when she saw him leave the room. Her fingers curled tightly around the railing as she watched him walk back toward their bedroom without looking back. She wanted to scream, to throw something, to demand answers. But something more dangerous than rage burned in her chest: insecurity. She no longer controlled her husband's attention, and worse, it was now directed at someone she considered beneath her. The next morning, Clarissa stood in the corridor, smiling sweetly as she ordered Chioma to clean the guest wing. But her eyes were like fire. When Chioma turned, Clarissa hissed under her breath, "Take his money. It won't buy you his name." Chioma didn't respond. She had heard enough venom in her life to know when silence was more powerful than a reply. In the kitchen, the maids noticed Clarissa's stiffness and Chioma's quiet poise, and the whispering began again. Mama Peace watched everything with quiet knowing. That night, as Chioma sat by herself, Junior snuck in with a folded paper in his hand. "It's a drawing of you," he whispered. "You look like the sun." Chioma's eyes filled with tears. She kissed the top of his head and held the drawing to her chest, unaware that Obinna, standing in the shadows of the hallway again, had seen and heard everything. The kitchen filled with the warm scent of a goosey stew as Chioma stirred carefully, humming under her breath. She was unaware that above her, Clarissa paced like a storm cloud ready to break. Humiliation had become her morning tea ever since Obinna's coldness toward her increased. He no longer touched her, barely spoke, and worst of all, defended that maid. Her jealousy had crossed into obsession, and obsession, unchained, was dangerous. That afternoon, as Chioma carried a tray of hot water toward the backstairs, Clarissa walked ahead of her with calculated steps. At the top of the stairs, she paused, turned, and accidentally bumped into Chioma. The tray spilled, and the kettle tipped, scalding water cascading toward Chioma's legs. The scream that followed shook the house. Chioma collapsed on the steps, clutching her shin, skin already blistering. Clarissa screamed too, but it was all performance. She slipped. I tried to help. But this time, the act didn't hold. Ada had seen it. Mama Peace had seen it. Even the driver, who was nearby, had heard Clarissa mutter something under her breath before the incident. The household buzzed with tension. Chioma was rushed to the staff clinic room inside the mansion, and a nurse was called. As she whimpered in pain, Junior sat beside her, refusing to eat until he saw her smile. Chief Obinna came back from a board meeting early, and was furious when he saw her bandaged leg. "How did this happen?" he asked, his voice grave. Mama Peace, Ada, and even the normally silent butler all stepped forward. "Sir, it was Madam." That sentence, spoken quietly, cracked the mansion's foundations. Clarissa walked in seconds later, and Obinna turned to her, eyes dark. "Pack a bag. Go to your sister's. I need air." Clarissa screamed, wailed, and accused everyone of conspiracy. She claimed they were trying to poison her marriage, but no one responded. The maids refused to meet her eyes. Even Junior walked away from her when she reached for his hand. That night, Chioma lay on her thin mattress, leg elevated, pain pulsing with every breath, but her heart strangely calm. She was still here, still standing, even in pain, and she now knew she was not alone. Upstairs, Obinna poured himself another untouched drink. He was beginning to see what the mansion had tried to hide from him. There were two queens in his life, one who had left him too soon, and another who had been walking barefoot under his roof all along, carrying grace in silence. The garden had once been a place of beauty and laughter, where Chief Obinna's late wife would tend to her hibiscus and tulips while Junior played nearby. But since her death, the flowers had withered, and the benches had remained empty. On a soft Saturday morning, Chief Obinna broke the routine. After insisting Chioma rest her bandaged leg in a shaded wheelchair, he invited her and Junior to sit with him in the garden. Junior ran ahead, excitedly pointing at flowers and dragging Chioma's chair closer to a wooden bench. For the first time in years, Obinna walked with his son under the sunlight, his stride slow, eyes watching his son's sudden joy. Chioma sat quietly, unsure of what to say, unsure why her heart was beating, as if it would leap from her chest. But then Obinna looked at her and asked softly, "Were your parents gardeners too?" His question was unexpected, not patronizing, just gentle. Chioma nodded and told him how her father planted sweet potatoes behind their hut and how her mother grew aloe vera for herbal remedies. Her voice trembled at first, but as Junior settled beside her and leaned on her lap, her words flowed like a breeze. Obinna listened, truly listened, his eyes never leaving her face. The more she spoke, the more he realized it wasn't just her resemblance to his wife that moved him. It was her heart, her ability to find beauty in ashes, her refusal to be hardened by loss. When Chioma spoke about how her brother used to pretend the aloe leaves were magic swords, Obinna laughed. A deep, honest laugh that startled even him. Chioma looked up, surprised by the sound. Junior clapped and shouted, "Daddy, you're laughing." They stayed in the garden longer than planned. Chioma noticed how Obinna relaxed in her presence, how he didn't command or critique. He just was. Junior fell asleep on Chioma's lap, and Obinna didn't interrupt. Instead, he helped reposition the chair under the tree and sat beside her. He spoke of his late wife then, not in broken sentences, but in long, flowing memory. How she used to leave him notes in his coat pocket. How she always knew when he was overwhelmed. She had a quiet kind of power, he said, just like you. The words made Chioma's eyes sting, but she didn't speak. What could she say? She was a maid with a burnt past. He was a billionaire with the world at his feet. And yet, in that garden, there were no titles. No pain. Just the quiet forming of a new kind of peace. Clarissa waited by the hallway window, like a predator sensing betrayal. Her eyes had followed Chioma's wheelchair as it disappeared with Obinna and Junior into the garden. Hours passed, and no one returned to the house. When she couldn't bear it anymore, she stormed into Obinna's study, the echo of her heels slicing through the hallway like thunder. He was just returning, his shirt slightly unbuttoned, his eyes unusually relaxed. But that peace vanished the moment Clarissa spoke. "So this is what we are now. Maid picnics and garden therapy." Her voice was sharp, mocking. Obinna didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked to the table, poured himself water, and asked, "What exactly do you want from me, Clarissa?" Her eyes widened. He had never used her name so coldly. She launched into a tirade about how she sacrificed everything to be his wife, how the maids disrespected her, how Junior hated her because of his emotional damage, not her. She accused Chioma of seduction, of manipulation, of playing the innocent village girl to climb into their family. Obinna listened quietly, and when she was done, he said calmly, "Chioma has done more for this family with her silence than you have with all your screaming." Clarissa's face went pale. She stepped closer, dropping the act. "If you don't fire that girl, I'll leave. I'll make it public. I'll destroy your name." Her voice was low, her nails digging into her own palm. But Obinna only looked at her with something worse than anger, indifference. "Then go," he said. "The door has never been locked." Clarissa didn't expect that. Her power had always come from fear. Fear that Obinna would lose reputation. fear that Junior would fall apart, fear that the mansion would collapse without her control. But now, her greatest fear had a face, Chioma. And what terrified her wasn't the girl's beauty or presence. It was her power. Chioma didn't manipulate. She didn't threaten. She simply existed in peace. And that peace was loud enough to expose every flaw Clarissa tried to bury. That night, Clarissa stood at her mirror, removing her earrings with trembling hands. For the first time, she saw the truth. She was no longer the woman Obinna looked at. And she feared, more than anything, that she never had been. The next morning, Clarissa struck back with vengeance, disguised as formality. She stormed into the kitchen in her bathrobe and heels, threw a folder on the counter, and announced loudly, "Chief has authorized me to restructure the staff. Effective immediately, Chioma is relieved of her duties. She'll be gone before lunch." The maid stared in stunned silence. Chioma, who had just entered to refill the kettle, froze in place. Clarissa smirked, as if she had finally won. "Pack your things," she added sharply. "You'll be paid your balance." Mama Peace stood up from her seat slowly, her face unreadable. "Show us the authorization," she said. Clarissa blinked. "Excuse me." Mama Peace repeated, firmer this time. "Show us where Chief signed that." Clarissa hesitated. The folder only contained a typed letter with her forged signature at the bottom. But before she could speak, the butler stepped in from the hallway. "Madam, Sir said if you cause any more unrest, you should vacate the house," he said calmly. "He left orders this morning. Chioma is not to be touched." The room erupted, not in chaos, but in silent, powerful resistance. One by one, each maid placed down their utensils and moved to stand beside Chioma. Even the younger ones, scared as they were, joined. Clarissa's face crumpled into disbelief. She had never seen the staff united, never imagined that one broken girl could inspire that kind of loyalty. "You're all choosing a maid over you, madam," she spat. Mama Peace looked her dead in the eye. "We're choosing dignity over fear." Chioma stood in the center, overwhelmed, her hands trembling. Never in her life had anyone stood up for her like this. Not since the fire. Not since her family died. The loyalty of these women, their defiance, ignited something in her soul that she had thought long dead. Clarissa stormed out, but the silence she left behind was louder than any insult. That night, Chioma wept in her room, not from pain, but from a sense of worth she hadn't felt in years. Upstairs, Obinna, having heard the report from his butler, sat back in his chair and smiled faintly. Something was changing in his home, not through power or wealth, but through truth, through love, through a maid who reminded them all what it meant to live with heart. The mansion was quiet that night, but not peaceful. After Clarissa's failed attempt to oust Chioma, the air hung with a kind of tension that made the walls feel tighter. The maids moved about quietly, cleaning as if walking on eggshells. Junior lay curled on his bed, the covers pulled up to his chin. The soft moonlight spilled through the curtains, but it brought no comfort. He had overheard Clarissa shouting again, this time about his father. Her voice, filled with venom, had said things no child should hear. "That boy doesn't even like me. He stares at me like I'm a ghost." Junior wasn't sure what hurt more, her words or the fear that maybe she was right. He had never loved her, and now he feared she might never leave. Unable to sleep, Junior crept down the hallway in his socks and pajama top, holding his favorite toy car in one hand. He didn't knock on Chioma's door. He just pushed it open and stood there, teary-eyed. Chioma, half asleep on her small mattress, sat up immediately. "Junior," she whispered, reaching out. He dropped the car and ran into her arms, sobbing. "Please don't go," he whispered. "She said she'll send you away. I don't want another mummy. I want you." Chioma froze. Her heart shattered. She cradled him gently, rocking him with a tenderness only grief could teach. "I'm not your mummy, Junior," she said quietly, "but I will never leave you. Even if they throw me out, I'll always be here for you, here." She pointed to his chest. He nodded, pressing his cheek against her heart. "You're like my real mummy," he whispered, falling asleep in her arms. Unbeknownst to them, Chief Obinna stood at the doorway, frozen. He had returned late from a shareholders' dinner and gone to check on Junior, only to find his son missing. The sight before him, Chioma gently rocking his son with tears in her eyes, hit him harder than any boardroom betrayal or business collapse ever had. It was as if the pain he had buried beneath work and silence had been lifted by this one fragile moment. He didn't interrupt. He stepped back quietly, closed the door, and leaned against the wall. The ache in his chest was no longer grief. It was awakening. He realized, for the first time in a long time, that his son was healing. And the person responsible wasn't him. It wasn't therapy. It wasn't time. It was a girl with scars, a soft voice, and the kind of love that expected nothing in return. Chief Obinna hadn't been feeling well for days, but he had ignored the signs, the headaches, the chills, the shortness of breath. Stress, he told himself. Overwork. Old age. But that morning, as he rose from bed, his vision spun, and the room tilted sideways. He collapsed to the floor. Clarissa was nowhere in sight. She had stormed off early after another silent breakfast. It was the houseboy who found him and raised the alarm. The staff rushed up the stairs, but it was Chioma who reached him first. She knelt beside his sweating body and called his name gently. "Sir." "Chief, can you hear me?" He nodded weakly. "Please don't move," she whispered, brushing a damp cloth over his forehead. The house's private nurse was called, but in that moment, it was Chioma who became the source of calm. She stayed by his side through the examination, helping administer the blood pressure check, reminding the nurse of his dietary restrictions, and calming Junior, who had begun crying. Obinna watched her even through the haze of dizziness. Her hands were sure but soft, her voice firm but gentle. She reminded him of his late wife, who had once cared for him during a typhoid scare with the same quiet efficiency. When the nurse said he needed to rest and stay hydrated, it was Chioma who stayed to monitor his fluids and bring warm soup from the kitchen. Clarissa returned hours later, irritated by the nurse's report and even more furious when she found Chioma sitting beside her husband's bed. "What is she doing here?" she snapped. Obinna, still weak, simply replied, "Let her stay." Clarissa stormed out again, but the damage was done. Obinna, exhausted and sweating, turned his head toward Chioma. "You remind me of her," he said softly. "My wife." Chioma looked up, startled. "Not because you look like her," he added, "but because you love people without condition." Chioma blinked rapidly to keep from crying. She was just a maid, a girl who had lost everything. But this man, this powerful, respected man, was looking at her as if she was someone. Not a servant, not an orphan, not a girl from ashes, but someone who mattered. As she dipped the cloth into water again and wiped his forehead, she realized something she had been too afraid to acknowledge. Her heart was no longer just healing. It was beginning to love again. For days, Chief Obinna remained in bed, slowly regaining strength. The household shifted. The maids became quieter, more careful, aware that things were changing. Clarissa, visibly on edge, had begun snapping at even the smallest mistakes. Tea too cold, curtains too bright, the floor too loud under her heels. But what she didn't know was that her late-night activities had finally drawn attention beyond whispers. It began with small observations, the head security guard, Colonel, being seen near her room more often than necessary. The younger guards noticed, but said nothing at first. But when Colonel was caught adjusting his shirt inside the laundry room and Clarissa emerged moments later, face flushed and hair out of place, they began talking. Mama Peace overheard the guards one morning as they smoked near the back fence. "She's not even subtle again," one of them muttered. "Nah, so she dey use power," another said, shaking his head. The rumors found their way into the kitchen, then to the corridor, and finally reached the butler, who informed Chief Obinna's personal assistant. When Obinna heard the whispers, he was quiet. He didn't react publicly, but inside something snapped. The betrayal he had long ignored had now become undeniable. His pride had blinded him, and the woman he had married to heal his family had instead turned his home into a circus of secrets. He asked the butler for confirmation, and when he got it with time-stamped footage and schedules, he sat back and stared out the window, silent for a long time. Meanwhile, Chioma sensed the storm approaching. She noticed Clarissa's restlessness, how she avoided Obinna's room and paced the hallway with anxious energy. One night, as Chioma passed the front garden on her way from the clinic room, she saw Clarissa sitting alone on the swing, staring into space. Their eyes met briefly, and Clarissa's gaze was not angry, it was frightened. She knew her mask was slipping. She knew Chioma had seen too much, heard too much, endured too much to be dismissed anymore. And for the first time since she entered that mansion, Clarissa realized she wasn't just fighting a maid. She was fighting someone who had already survived more than she could ever imagine. Someone who, without lifting a finger, had become the most powerful woman in the house. The morning sun filtered weakly through the tall living room windows, casting a golden light on the marble tiles. Chioma was dusting quietly when she noticed something odd, a shimmering gold phone lying on the couch, unguarded and unlocked. Clarissa had stormed out just moments ago, clearly flustered after a heated phone call with someone Chioma couldn't identify. Normally, the woman was glued to that phone, clutching it like a lifeline. But now it sat in plain view, screen glowing with an unread message. Chioma's eyes lingered on it longer than she intended. The phone vibrated. A photo popped up. What she saw made her freeze. It was Clarissa, half-clothed, posing in front of a mirror. The message beneath read, "Last night was wild. When are we doing it again?" Cunnel sweat droplets. Her heart thundered. She quickly turned away, breathing hard, overwhelmed by shock. It wasn't the vulgarity that hit her, it was the confirmation. The whispers were true. The pain in Obinna's eyes wasn't paranoia. Clarissa was not just cruel. She was unfaithful. The very woman who had tormented her, humiliated the staff, and destroyed the peace of a grieving home had now brought shame to the same man she claimed to love. Chioma didn't want to be involved in scandal. She didn't want to hurt anyone. But something inside her knew this was bigger than her. As she turned to walk away, Chief Obinna entered the room quietly. He paused when he saw her, then noticed the phone still on the couch. "Whose phone?" he asked. Chioma said nothing. Her eyes met his, and for a long, heavy moment, she struggled to speak. Then she simply stepped aside. Obinna walked forward, picked up the phone, and his entire face changed as the messages began to flood in. He didn't say a word, just stood still as screen after screen of vulgar messages, pictures, and flirtatious conversations between his wife and the security guard revealed the betrayal in its rawest form. Chioma turned to leave, but Obinna's voice stopped her. "Thank you for not hiding it." His words were quiet, almost broken. She nodded once and left the room. And as she disappeared down the corridor, Obinna sat in his chair, Clarissa's phone still glowing in his hand, and stared at the wall as though he could see through time itself, through every mistake, every warning sign he'd ignored, every moment he'd looked away. Clarissa returned an hour later, laughing loudly on another call, pretending all was well. She tossed her shopping bags onto the table and called for one of the maids to bring water, not noticing that Obinna was waiting in the study. The butler informed her with a cold tone, "Sir would like to speak with you. Alone." Clarissa's smile flickered, but remained fixed as she strutted to the study. She opened the door and found Obinna sitting with the phone in his hand. Her heart dropped. "Oh, you found my phone," she began, feigning nonchalance. "I was just—" He raised a hand, silencing her. "Sit." His tone was not angry, it was final. She obeyed, slowly, like prey realizing the trap had snapped shut. He placed the phone on the desk between them, screen up. "Explain," he said. Clarissa glanced at the messages and chuckled nervously. "That's nothing, Obinna. Just jokes. You know how people exaggerate things in text." Obinna's face didn't move. He leaned forward. "You were in my house, my bed, playing a role you never deserved. But this is the last insult I will ever allow." Clarissa's smile cracked. She began to cry, first dramatically, then desperately. She dropped to her knees, clinging to his hand. "Please, don't believe what you saw. It was a mistake. I was lonely. You were always distant." But Obinna pulled his hand away. "You were not lonely. You were greedy. You wanted my wealth, my power. But you never wanted me, not really. You abused my son, tore my home apart, and tried to destroy the only light left in this house." Clarissa's face twisted with fury. "This is about that maid, isn't it? That thing you've been eyeing," she spat. "She bewitched you with her pretty eyes and soft voice. You think she's better than me?" Obinna stood, his face unreadable. "She didn't need to be better than you, Clarissa. She only needed to be decent." With that, he pressed a button and summoned the butler. "Escort Madame Clarissa to her room. Have her belongings packed. I'll arrange for her transport first thing tomorrow." Clarissa screamed, cursed, begged. But her voice echoed into nothing. Her empire, built on beauty, deceit, and fear, had crumbled in one breath. And as she was escorted out, she caught sight of Chioma in the hallway, standing quietly, eyes full of compassion. Clarissa looked away, not out of pride, but shame. Because for the first time in her life, she had met a woman whose strength needed no audience. Clarissa didn't leave quietly. That night, she made one final attempt, not through manipulation, but through destruction. Before dawn, she slipped into Junior's room. He was still asleep, curled under his blankets. She sat on the edge of his bed and stroked his hair, whispering softly. "That maid doesn't love you," she said. "She wants your daddy's money. She'll leave you like your real mummy did." Her voice was like poison, calm, slow, deliberate. Junior stirred, eyes fluttering open. He didn't speak. He just stared at her. "She's pretending," Clarissa continued. "And when your daddy marries her, she'll make you clean her shoes." She smiled then, proud of her final seed of evil. "Go tell your daddy you don't want her. He'll listen to you." But Junior surprised her. He sat up, pulled his blanket tighter, and looked her in the eye. "You're the one pretending," he said softly. "You shout when daddy's not here. You break things and blame people. You told me I was ugly, but Chioma makes me laugh. And when she hugs me, it feels like sunshine." Clarissa froze. "You're lying," she hissed. "You don't know what you're saying." Junior shook his head. "I told Daddy already. He said you won't live here anymore." Clarissa stood, her face pale with fury, but before she could reply, Obinna appeared in the doorway. He had heard everything. "Don't ever touch my son again," he said. "You've done enough damage." Clarissa looked from father to son, defeated. This time, she didn't fight. She simply walked out, the click of her heels sounding like the fall of an empire. Later that morning, after the car took Clarissa away, Obinna sat in the garden with Chioma and Junior. The sun was warm, the birds alive with song, and the flowers finally seemed to bloom again. Junior held Chioma's hand tightly, as if anchoring himself to something real. Obinna turned to her. "You've changed this house," he said. "Not by shouting, not by demanding, just by being good." Chioma shook her head. "I didn't come here to change anything. I just wanted to survive." Obinna smiled. "Then maybe survival is the strongest kind of love." For the first time, Chioma didn't resist the warmth in her chest. She let it bloom, quiet, deep, and undeniable. Because in a house that once echoed with grief, she had become the one sound that finally brought healing. The weeks following Clarissa's departure brought a strange calm to the mansion. The tension that had once crept through the walls like smoke had finally lifted, and for the first time in a long while, the house felt like a home again. Chioma returned to her duties, quieter than ever, unsure of her place in this new peace. Though the maids treated her with reverence, and Junior clung to her every chance he got, Chioma remained cautious. She wasn't used to being the center of anything, attention, honor, or love. She had spent years surviving quietly, avoiding notice. But now, her presence was undeniable. Obinna had started joining her during chores, asking about her grandmother, listening when she spoke about grief and dreams, and offering the kind of attention that scared her more than Clarissa ever did, because it was real. One evening, Obinna asked her to sit with him on the back veranda. The sunset painted the sky in strokes of crimson and gold, and Junior chased butterflies in the nearby grass. "You've done more for this home than anyone else ever has," he said, his voice low but certain. "You brought laughter back into my son's life. You brought me back to myself, and you never asked for anything." Chioma smiled faintly, eyes lowered. I'm just grateful for the roof over my head, sir, she whispered. But Obinna shook his head. No, you're not just a maid. You're a woman who has carried pain with grace, who has loved without condition, who has healed what I thought was beyond repair. She looked up at him then, tears burning her eyes, not because of his words, but because for the first time she believed them. Obinna reached out, gently taking her hand. You reminded me of the woman I lost, but now I see you, Chioma. And I don't want to lose you too. Chioma's heart raced. She had no words, no script, no preparation for what love felt like when it was gentle, earned, and true. I'm not the kind of woman people marry, she said, her voice trembling. My past is messy. I have no family. I'm just Obinna stopped her with a quiet, steady gaze. You're the woman I choose, he replied. Not because I pity you, but because I see you. Because my son loves you. Because I love you. And in that moment, the pain, shame, and silence she had carried for years cracked, and something new emerged. Not a woman who begged for love, not a servant ashamed of her story, but a soul finally ready to believe she was worthy of being chosen, not out of charity, but out of truth. The wedding was small, quiet, and without extravagance. No press, no gold plate de invitations, just the staff, a few trusted friends, and the two people who had walked through fire and grief to find each other. Chioma wore a simple cream gown Mama Peace had sewn with trembling hands, and Junior held her hand proudly as he walked her down the garden aisle. Chief Obinna stood waiting, dressed in a crisp white ibada, his eyes soft, steady, and filled with joy. There were no lavish speeches, just heartfelt vows exchanged beneath the same hibiscus tree his late wife once planted. And though her memory lingered in the petals around them, it did not cast a shadow. Instead, it smiled, welcoming, approving, at peace. In the weeks that followed, life shifted into something quietly beautiful. Junior thrived. He laughed more, studied with excitement, and told everyone who would listen, "My mummy's name is Chioma now." The maids, once cautious, now served with joy. The mansion, once a battleground of secrets, had become a sanctuary. Chioma didn't demand change. She became the change. She still did chores sometimes by choice. She helped the maids with their children's fees. She visited her grandmother every weekend with Obinna. And though she now slept in the master bedroom and bore the title wife, she never stopped being the woman who knelt in the dirt to pick up a broken toy or held a crying child like the world depended on it. Because she knew, healing isn't about power, it's about presence. 1 year later, the family photo was finally updated. In the center sat Obinna, older but more alive than ever. Beside him was Chioma, radiant in a flowing blue gown, her natural hair adorned with white beads. Junior stood between them, arms spread across their shoulders, grinning with all his teeth. Behind them bloomed the garden, vibrant, rich, alive. And in the far corner, quietly framed beside the new family portrait, was one final image. Obinna's late wife, smiling down with the kind of peace that comes when the ones you love find joy again. The mansion had once been built with wealth, but it was Chioma who turned it into a home born not of status or scandal, but of endurance, redemption, and the kind of love that never needed to be loud to be real. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tochi Stories for more.